we have the slides up, please? The PowerPoints, please, technicians. Anyway, I will start. Thank you all very much for coming and sharing your expertise and your projected contributions to a solution. I am a theoretical sociologist, so I do not have your practical experience. What I want to do is not repeat my paper, which is very boring, you can all read. I want to question two things. First of all, I want to question, and this does not mean antagonistically, it means to interrogate, or literally to question, the word modern slavery in our title. Grazie bene. It's very easy to use a word rhetorically. That doesn't mean it's being used accurately. So what I've done is to go back to the work of Orlando Patterson of Harvard, who has done a 10-year documentary study of the various kinds of slavery from antiquity, pre-antiquity onwards. It's an excellent piece of work, in which he distinguishes, not that one, here we go. He distinguishes three main characteristics after his very long survey of historic modes of slavery. These are all in my paper, so I have simply selected little quotations from Patterson himself, that slavery involves always and everywhere domination, that it's a relationship of total power and a powerlessness on the part of the victim, that it entails, and this is the title of his book, Slavery and Social Death. What does he mean by social death? Total absence of social integration, in which where you come from, what your ties are with your home, family, kinship, geography, etc., are completely obliterated. They count for nothing. And where any relationships of friendship that you form in the abominable conditions in which we live, but this is one of the things about friendship, it survives concentration camps and the worst things that people can do to other people, this counts for nothing either. In other words, you have ceased to belong in your own right to any legitimate part of the social order. You are an isolate. Thirdly, you are automatically disqualified from the game that we are all involved with. How do you win honor and repute within your own community, whether you define it as your neighborhood, your university, your religious order, for that matter? The slave, historically, was never expected to be competing for honor. He, she was dishonored by definition. And I think you can sustain these three criteria for modern trafficked people, and I do not differentiate between forced labor and sexual trafficking. All three criteria work equally well for both of these groups, which are exceedingly difficult to distinguish from one another in empirical practice. But there is one feature with regard to which Patterson himself says, this is not the most yeah, now it's letting me play. Come on. There was one, okay, it's okay. There is one feature that modern trafficking does not share with historical slavery. Despite the many and varied forms that historic slavery took, nearly every single one of them had this fourth feature built into it: manumission, the giving of freedom, often meaning the purchasing, financial purchasing of freedom by the enslaved. And Patterson argues, I find very convincingly, that manumission is part of the slavery system. As he puts it, what does a slave dream of most deeply? She dreams of freedom. And there are means of obtaining your freedom within most historic forms of slavery. But it's absent, and this is what gives the slave master his power, that he knows of this dream, and he waves this carrot, as we say in English, in front of the enslaved. The better you behave as a slave, the more likely you are to win your freedom. It's another method at a different level of control. And that's why Patterson considers it integral to slavery. So what I want to argue is not that he is wrong. In fact, I want to support Patterson and say, actually, there is a modern version of manumission, which is informal rather than formal, and it consists in the simple, natural fact that trafficked people, like everybody else, are subject to aging. Now, aging, if you are sex trafficked and working in a brothel, may mean you have reached 25 or maybe 30. If you're working on a construction site on high erection buildings without a safety harness, it may mean much the same age or a little older. And these are the stages where the economic value of the trafficked person to be crude diminishes. The efforts that are put in by the traffickers to detain them, restrain them, are diminished. They instead are allowed to drift off without huge efforts to regain them. And apart from some, and we don't know what proportions, it's no use pretending that we do, apart from some trafficked persons of all kinds of forced labor who become part of the business. And let's not deny it, they exist. And therefore, they stop being a slave and they start being an oppressor. So there is this informal kind of manumission, and I want to return to this at the very end of my paper. But what I want to do, because it's very easy to make proclamations and declarations, protocols and conventions, but what we need to do is to understand the actual mechanisms, causal mechanisms, rat this thing, no. I love technology. There we go. And it's very small, and probably you have difficulty reading it. What it is, you read it clockwise, and you start with the little figures. And what it's an attempt to do is to show you in the bold lines those factors that, thank you. Number one, top right, that's it, good. Those factors that increase the amount of human trafficking, those are the solid lines. The dotted lines are those that diminish it. But don't think of the dotted lines as the good guys. They just diminish it, maybe for the wrong reasons, and as we'll see as we go round the clock, they are indeed usually the wrong reasons. So I begin with the fact that we are not just talking about globalization. Globalization is always misused by social scientists. The demonstration of that is some use it as a cause and some use it as a consequence. In fact, it's just an effect within which things happen. So I start with the rise of competitive multinational production in trying to account for why, for two things, why human trafficking is on the increase and why the delay in condemning it after slavery had been condemned for 2 centuries has been so long in coming and has been left to the international associations who have properly addressed us this morning, because they have in fact been the most active in this respect. But what got the increase going? I'm arguing competitive multinational production, otherwise known as multinational capitalism. Let's say the C word, the forbidden word. It wouldn't be competitive if it were not capitalist. It depends upon cheap labor, and the demand for it grows. And we can see this growth, we'll see it this afternoon in some of the figures that Juan Jose gives us, of the different parts of the world that human trafficking is moving to, because it is a source of cheap labor. And what this actually helps to explain is something that is otherwise rather puzzling in the data, inadequate as it is. But the data does repetitively reveal that 3/4 of human trafficking is intra-regional. It's within the same region. Why? Well, sure, it's cheaper to do and it's easier to organize. That's undoubtedly true, but unless there is a demand for trafficked labor, then it doesn't matter that it's cheaper and easier to do it, wouldn't happen. And that demand is stoked by the multinational enterprises that have outsourced their production to sites which are not labor organized, where there is no minimum wage, where often wages are not paid at all, where conditions are terrible, like the garment factory in Bangladesh that collapsed a couple of weeks ago. And we can track this around the world, and there is no country in the world that can say, I have clean hands. It's very, very interesting to me, and I'm not getting at the United States of America, but the US is very keen, and it has a very good track record, as Melissa will show us, on condemnation of prostitution. It's good in that respect. It's truly appalling on forced labor, non-sexual forced labor. Why? Because Walmart benefits, Nike benefits, and all the software producers throughout the world benefit. And this also shows why, well, according to the UNDOC, they estimate in 2006 in Asia, Pacific, Middle East, and Africa, 18% of trafficking was forced labor. Only 4 years later, that figure has gone up to a percentage of 36%. Why? Because so many Western companies have shifted their production sites into these countries. So that's trying to unpack what demand means. Now, as we move from one box, we move into box 2 now, which is still about the increase of forced labor. Each of these I'm trying to signal, in a sociological sense, intervention points, points where something can be done. So the box 2 is about the increase in demand, and we have to explain that. That is not self-evident at all, that there should be an increase in demand, particularly if we look at sex trafficking. Every country has its supply of women. Why is there demand? It's not obvious. Except that in the most developed countries, the market is two things. It is very advanced, even though China and India are catching up extremely fast, it is very advanced in communications, computerized technology, ICT. And ICT has been horrendously abused in the West for sexual purposes, for making DVDs, for supplying all these files of pedophilic photos of children. And just last week, there was a suggestion made to Google and Microsoft downwards that the software should be supplied to the person who buys, or the institution who buys, desktops or laptops, to have a default setting which was clean, which did not give your kids, your employees, access to pornographic material. A default setting which the customer could turn off. And the software producers refused to do this. They preferred to stoke the demand for sexual material, the kind, as I say in my paper, because it always affronts me. You go into a perfectly respectable hotel, and there is a little thing, well, it's not so little, on your dressing table or your desk, and it says, ring reception for adult movies. I don't want to be informed that, pornography is purchasable at reception, thank you. But this is all part of the normalization of expressive sexuality, and therefore it is one of the factors that keeps this percentage high of trafficked, not just women, but also young boys. It's a varied market, and some children. It keeps it high, and it probably makes it, unlike the countries I was talking about, mainly in Eastern Asia, it makes those destined for sex work in greater demand in Europe and in America. So, yes, I have to move on fast. Move down to the bottom box, the third one. So we have a growth in sex trafficking, and nothing is holding it back, restraining it so far. But it creates a problem. I'm not going to break my heart. I don't think any of you are. It creates a problem for the traffickers. Just remember, so far they've been dealing intra-regionally. It's not been too hard. Now they're dealing to begin with, inter-regionally and then transnationally. Now it gets a lot more difficult. This morning you gave us a very nice example of the complexity of the route that can be involved, and often is involved, involving about 4 or 5 means of transport in some cases to get from Africa to destination. And this is becoming more and more typical. What it means is that the very self-same technology that is fueling the demand, the ICT business, is also absolutely essential to the development of transcontinental trafficking organizations. And we now have, and it needs a lot more research doing on it, interlocking mafias. And the UN in 2002 did a very interesting study showing how the Nigerian money launderers were tied in with the Moldovan traffickers, who formed an unholy alliance with the Italian mafia, and so it went on. In other words, it's another trade that is added to drugs. Well, it began innocently with cigarette dealing. Drugs dealing, arms dealing, and now let's deal in people. And on each of those transitional stages, not that anything is obliterated, but they're all added just because they add profitability. But in adding profitability, they enable the transcontinental organized traffickers to become much, much more sophisticated. These are no longer the thugs that you see in the movies. These are sharp, technical trained geeks who just happen to be dealing in the logistics of trafficking. So you get, we're moving up the corner. We've got to about 25 to 12 now. You get increased trafficking because of this, and longer distance trafficking hauls. And this leads to, thank you very much for that. This leads on number 4 to the growth of opposition to migrants. Now we're getting straight into the political science field here, and this is where I say the opponents of trafficking are probably doing it for the wrong reasons. Now in France, we have the famille Le Pen and the Front National. I'm not getting at France. In Britain, we have the United Kingdom Independence Party, and these are simply anti-migrant. They lack the roots. This is the French, one of the French angles on this. In Britain, they take our jobs. There are all sorts of ridiculous myths that are perpetrated, and the one fact that is never presented is, for example, that something like the British National Health Service or the British Old Age Care Service simply could not work without workers from other countries. And in fact, even when politics has been at its most repressive towards, well, they usually call them economic migrants, which just makes them look money hungry. Even when they've been most repressive towards that, and Ireland, the Republic of Ireland is a wonderful example, they have always wanted to recruit female nurses from Philippines was the favorite country of origin because they were supposed to be very gentle and kind to old people. It's a stereotype, but maybe they fulfill it better than most countries. So yes, we always, in the European world, I think Mira will agree with me, we've always needed migrants. So the politics of simply a blanket condemnation of migration is a very vicious and blunt instrument. And it operates a you and them. Well, who are the we in Europe? The we is changing. You know, we're now 27 countries in the EU, and it was only 2007 that Romania and Bulgaria became members. Prior to that, the latest joiner was Poland. Poland has really accomplished wonders in Europe in terms of useful employment that we all value, despite all those terrible jokes about a plombiero polacca and so on. But Romanians, for example, they're confused with the Roma, which would be probably make, well, it does make the Romanians as angry as it would make the French and the British confusing the gypsies with the indigenous population. So a huge repression of migration in general, and this is what is enabling political parties to become electable heaven help us, you know, if we get UKIP. But what it means to move up a block is that our nation states are not the agencies that are going to be the most aggressive defenders or prosecutors, defenders of the trafficked and prosecutors of the traffickers. They're just anti-migration. They're not really all that concerned about the trafficked. And this is one of the contributory factors, it's not the sole one, but it leads to low prosecution rates. I am completely with Angela that criminal justice is necessary. I don't think it's essential. I don't think it's sufficient. But the prosecution rates are minuscule compared to the size of the problem. And this is why we go to the top of the diagram, and it's left to the global agencies, UN, ILO, EU, to oppose trafficking. But how? Mainly by criminalizing it. And the factor I want to put my finger on is, in conclusion, is that part of criminalization actually depends upon effective witnesses. The witnesses are the trafficked themselves who will tell their stories in court. But there needs to be in place effective witness protection schemes for these people who are in danger from their traffickers. And repatriation actually works very much against this. It gets them out too quickly. That's just from the point of view of criminal justice. It doesn't give them the chance to discover what their civil rights are in the country that they have found themselves. They probably don't even speak its language. Finally, the qualitative data we have shows that 1/2 of those who were trafficked knew and communicated with their trafficker or the representative thereof. Repatriate these people, and they are in danger from their original contact. Because what will they do back? I hesitate to call it home, because some of them were sold from home by their own families. They will tell their stories about their experiences. And this is the one thing they don't want to happen. So, in conclusion, I would very much like those agencies that are available to do this to consider some of the things that the NGOs have pioneered. They've done it all around the world. I'll just pick on one example of Italy, where voluntary associations set up various kinds of housing that led to autonomy. They encouraged, it got given and then it got withdrawn, legislation that gave them stay permits, which could later be turned into work permits. It gave them job placement schemes, Italian lessons, which were extremely useful for living and working in the country. In other words, it was leading the way. And it was leading the way to what I want to end on, which is going back to why I accentuated manumission. What sort of life can we envisage for somebody who has been trafficked and has now reached, let's just call it middle age? Can they become, how can they become integrated, reintegrated into the society in which they have been landed. There is no research on this. There are some figures that show, yes, you can leave a brothel and you can start working in a shoe factory. Well, yes, fine, but what chance do you have to make friends, to find a social life that doesn't drag you back into clubland, which is the one environment you know? How do you begin in what are rather isolated and getting more so because social solidarity is diminishing throughout Europe? How do we reintegrate them and help them to at least start a new life in a place where they didn't want to be in all probability in the first place? Thank you.